Hello everybody, and today I wanted to talk about coastal ships, submarines, and carriers. Now you may think that's an interesting combo of things to group together, as coastal ships are already in the game. We see them pretty consistently throughout all the battle ratings and everything else. But submarines and carriers we don't really see. We've had a couple submarine events, and carriers of course have NPC controls, but they typically aren't involved in the matches as far as blue water and everything else goes. But I think they do have some similarities, and mainly I just wanted to group them together to talk about issues I see in general with these three things. Getting into it, I want to talk about coastal first, as those are actually in the game. Now with these coastal ships, you can really tell that they were the starting tiers before War Thunder shifted direction, and they were going to be War Thunder's idea for just naval combat in general, before they decided that, hey, yeah, the bigger ships actually have more draw, and we're going to make those instead and charge people money for the fancy ones like the Prince Eugen. Even today, after they've pivoted away from that, they are still fairly confined to their own game mode until players start mixing blue water ships into the line with them. And even though they're only maxing out at 4.0 battle ratings and the blue water starts at 3.0, they actually cost the same to research as the max tier blue water ships, the 7.0 battleships. Yeah, this itty bitty 4.0 gunboat will cost as much to research as one of those, which I think is particularly horrendous, and it's the absolute reason why I actually stopped grinding the coastal ships, because I like the idea of having a torpedo boat as a support for my battleships when I want to go take a cap or just be a general pain in the ass. And instead I went and got the Shimakaze instead, because it fit in better and I didn't have to spend years researching it like I would an actual line of ships. On top of that, the 4.0 coastals actually have the same repair cost as the 7.0 battleships. And in saying that, I mean the repair cost per minute. Their actual highest maximum repair cost they can get is 1/3 the cost of a battleship, but still that's quite high for a small itty bitty ship that might not participate a lot in one of the matches with a blue water fleet, unless, like I said, it's only playing in its own game mode. And going off my previous statement about being able to tell that these were kind of what War Thunder started out with and then they shifted to the blue water fleet, these are some of the most unbalanced things when they're actually in a blue water game. They're either completely useless against whatever they're facing, even if it's a teeny tiny destroyer in the grand scheme of things, or they're an absolute menace. I'm looking at the SKRs in that regard, because it'll take 2 or 3 hits to actually sink these things and take them down, and meanwhile, due to the difference in the eras, they're actually tearing apart these pre-Great War destroyers, while these destroyers can't do anything to a Cold War era gunboat, if we were going to use that example. So the unbalance is fairly obvious, and it's both extremes. They're either completely useless against the larger ships, or they're completely overpowered and destroying quite a bit in the match before they're being taken down. Maybe the overpowered part isn't the word for it, but still, you get the picture. A lot of them are kind of just made to fight each other, even though some of them, like I said, do compete against the blue water. Mainly if they're going to be fighting a blue water ship, you'll see a lot of players take out the torpedo boats, as they're basically the only thing in the higher blue water matches that are going to participate as far as damage goes. And the gunboats themselves, well, short of capping, they're kind of useless. They're going to be able to destroy the motor torpedo boats, obviously, if they can track them down and catch them. And they're going to be able to fight for caps if they're just up against other blue water ships, or sorry, coastal ships. But as soon as a blue water ship shows up, they're kind of irrelevant. They're not going to be able to do so much in the grand scheme of things as far as damage output to even the smaller destroyers for the most part. So it makes the gunboat somewhat pointless outside of, like I said, just darting around for caps, but at the same time, there's a lot of ships with float planes that can do the same thing. So, pretty irrelevant. And on top of that, if you just spawned one of these to dart around and grab some caps and didn't deal any damage, it still costs you that spawn. So you get 3 spawns in ships per each naval match. So this is taking one of your spawns off that, and if you're doing it to just spawn in a gunboat instead of something with a float plane or a motor torpedo boat or even just a destroyer, you're wasting a spawn in that regard. And not only are you spawning it just to cap, basically if anything else looks at you, you're going to just be detonated. A lot of the smallest destroyers in the game can one-shot these smaller torpedo boats or gunboats, and even outside of that, if it's going to take a couple extra shots to kill you because it's actually a compartmentalized coastal ship, it's really not going to take these larger ships long to take you down, as their rounds are just going to devastate you. And the same can be said for secondary guns and even the automatic anti-aircraft guns that will, like I said, automatically target these smaller ships that the game engine recognizes it can penetrate. I have to specify that. A lot of them will just tear your ship apart, and you won't be being a menace for very long, as I'll put it. But I guess they do benefit in a regard from being hard to spot even in arcade battles, though going back to the gunboat thing, they're kind of detected at destroyer ranges anyway, or at least fairly close to them. So a lot of the larger ships are going to be able to see you coming or see you going for the caps that you're aiming for and get their guns online to either target you or let the secondaries or automatic anti-aircraft do their work. And another issue I see with these coastal ships are a lot of them are made for anti-sub activities, and that's basically pointless in the game right now as there's no submarines. So you basically can research some stuff that's going to do nothing to help you, like depth charges and stuff like that, and really it's just going to add more explosives to your ship for whenever something looks at you the wrong way. And even if you dart around and use the other option that a lot of these ships have, which is mines, it's very dependent on the enemy team actually, funneling their way towards where you're laying mines, and you not getting shot before you actually get to where you want to place the mines. It's very rare to see something killed by a mine in this game. I want to say I've only seen it 2 or 3 times the entire time I've been playing, outside of like the submarine events or maybe a couple of the coastal matches that I've played, but I really don't see it too often in blue water. Overall, I'd really like to see War Thunder reduce the costs on these ships to push them into like a better support role. Like I said, if people wanted to spawn them in to dart around and get caps or be a menace in a torpedo boat, it would definitely help people use them a lot more and actually take the time to research the line, rather than looking at it as, well, I could research a 4.0 for 400,000 RP, or I could research a 7.0 for 400,000 RP. Which one do I want to spend my time grinding towards? And along with that, I think if they actually did something where they allow the coastals to spawn in on an extra spawn, kind of like aircraft, that'd be kind of interesting and give people a reason to actually grind that line, as it would buff their support ability after their main ship has been sunk. As if you actually research something, it'll help you spawn in a better ship with that aircraft or coastal spawn, I believe. So I think in that regard it would definitely help people want to research these lines if War Thunder would make a few changes to actually make them viable, rather than being either a waste of a spawn or just a terrible thing to grind forever, short of getting into the torpedo boats and dragging them into a higher tier match. With coastal out of the way, I want to talk about submarines now. We have seen a few events with submarines, and they From my experience, they tend to be flooded with players very early on and then almost completely abandoned. I don't know if that is just a War Thunder event thing, or if the submarines got boring for everybody else, but it just seemed to be how it played out for me, in my opinion. The last event, at least, did a good job of showing off the slowness and vulnerability of the submarines, and it seemed like the best tactic during it was to try to catch the destroyers with mines and typically just trade your submarine for a destroyer, which doesn't seem like a very good gameplay loop to me. The submarines in it never really tended to reach the objective area to torpedo the merchant ships that they were going after, and it seemed primarily due to just the slow speed of the submarines and the relatively quick response of the destroyers that had, of course, sonar available to them to find the submarines and just drop depth charges on them to just absolutely obliterate them before they could really do anything. It was also very easy to see the submarines trying to launch their torpedoes and just move out of the way. It really didn't seem like that much of a threat to me. And the flooding mechanics in the last event seemed pretty wonky to me. The shell penetrations from the destroyers when the subs were on surface wouldn't prevent diving or cause issues with flooding, so I'm not sure if it was really worked out yet to where submarines could actually flood just from the destroyer guns actually poking holes in their hulls, because I would feel like that'd be a pretty large issue. Overall, in my opinion, the event got pretty boring fast for me, and I didn't play it too much just because, yeah, it was fun to dart around with the destroyer and bomb submarines out of the water, but, well, depth charge in a way, but it got boring to play as a submarine because you basically had to dive down to however far to avoid the sonar pings, and then go fairly slowly so you didn't cavitate until you got hopefully over to where the fleet was, and then by that time there'd probably be planes up to just bomb you. So it really got old for me fast. As per if these were actually introduced into the game on like blue water maps, I don't feel like they'd fare very well because the maps are typically larger in most cases, and I think the slow speed of the sub would be to their detriment along with their relatively low hit point pool, I'd say, if that's a term I can use to describe War Thunder's mechanics. Really, I just don't see them being very survivable and slow and just not very good on the maps we have currently. And to go on with that, the frontline ships that we have in War Thunder, typically the ones that are actually going to get the caps, aren't the big slow battleships. It's the faster cruisers and destroyers and torpedo boats and gunboats and stuff like that, and most of those are loaded down with anti-sub capabilities, so they're going to be able to spot these submarines and absolutely decimate them if they're anywhere near where these ships are operating. And really, if the subs wanted to just try to sneak to a cap zone, they're relatively slow, so they wouldn't be able to get there quickly, obviously, or in a relatively decent amount of time to affect the match. I mean, it might be a thing where, you know, they get there 3/4 of the way through the match, but by then it's probably over, as the other two cap points they'll have no effect on. So really, I don't see a lot of effect for them, short of if, you know, you just spawn them under the enemy fleet at the start of the game and let them try to do something, I guess. It's just really weird. Basically anything that a submarine could do, I think the torpedo boats that we have currently do even better. You know, they have pretty decent torpedoes, they're fast torpedoes, and the boats themselves are doing 100+ kilometers an hour versus the sub 20 that submarines could do. So I think with how it all works out, I think the torpedo boats actually do it better right now. And I think with how the spotting mechanics work too, they're probably stealthier in that regard as well. So personally, I don't really see a place for subs outside of events or maybe their own game mode, but I just don't see the benefit in actually adding them to Blue Water Fleet unless they were significantly non-historic, to say the least. And last but probably least, we have carriers. Yes, I agree with people that carriers are pretty majestic warships and very important to history. But I think that if we added them to the game, it would invalidate most of the ships in the game and also the gameplay loop that we are already at right now. I think World of Warships is proof that they are almost impossible to balance and keep enjoyable when you're also trying to include the battleship gameplay and everything else. And currently we already do have a plane spawning system in the first place, and the single planes can already one-shot or repeatedly devastate most ships in the game, so I don't really see a spot for the carriers. And it certainly wouldn't help that War Thunder would most likely keep you confined to single planes, not full squadrons. And I'd be curious to see if you'd be researching planes again to launch off said carriers, or if they would have their own, additions from the lines you've already researched, if you even went down those lines. So it's kind of a weird, how would it be implemented, what would it even accomplish type deal in that regard. On top of that, I would think just having a carrier takeoff would be a pretty big detriment to most planes in the game, as even in arcade it takes a while for these planes to climb, and with how players blob up in these matches, and even some ships just on their own, their anti-aircraft can be absolutely devastating. And a lot of people you see do decently in planes in these matches climb high enough that the anti-aircraft isn't really even firing at them. So I would think the carrier takeoff would either leave these planes really vulnerable at low speeds and low altitude, or take these players a long time to climb up to where the planes are actually going to be effective for a decent amount of time, which by then, you've been bored for a while and trying to get these older planes to climb up to however many feet they need in order to not be torn apart by the anti-aircraft. To couple along with that, the maps really aren't set up for carriers either, as you can basically see the entire enemy fleet at spawn, and I would think if carriers were in the game, they'd be picked off immediately just due to the map's openness, relatively easy spotting, and just because they're easy targets for stuff like battleships or even some of the cruisers. So I really don't see a good spot for them as per how the maps are worked out or the gameplay loop we have currently. I'm not really sure why people ask for them, as we kind of already have planes and we already have the battleships brawling as most people enjoy. And if you wanted to look at games like World of Warships, they had to limit the amount of carriers in matches and change them multiple times, and it's just a mess with those carriers that they have. So in balancing wise, I don't think it would end up being very fun. Outside of historical value and their nice ship designs, I just don't see the benefit of adding them. On the flip side though, I think it would be interesting to see an event with them, if War Thunder's mechanics can even handle something like squadron control. Personally, I'd imagine it'd just be a repeat of World of Warships' old carriers with the squadrons, minus maybe the RTS, where you're completely overpowered because you have a bunch of torpedo bombers that you're controlling all at once. So I really just don't see the place for carriers. Anyways, if you guys think that maybe I'm looking at this wrong and there is a spot for these ships and a ways to make them viable outside of coastal, I think coastal just needs to be changed a little bit. But submarines and carriers, if you can think of a way to make them viable and make them decent additions to the game, I'm curious to see what your reasoning is on that. Anyways guys, I'll see you in the next one, and good luck out there.